And I think it's the leaders at the lowest level, and this is kind of counterintuitive because it goes against the very way in which the ACNA is structured. It's the leaders at the lowest level, so priests and deacons, think about that, who have, I think, the best chance to stop it and to begin the process of accountability because they are the most proximate, typically, to the abuse.
When does a church that's situated like ours ever talk about this stuff? Like, at what point do things keep stacking up that you're willing to say, man, enough? In light of the presentment now against the archbishop and the Washington Post article, at what point are you a priest over a parish and you say, in some way, we're all implicated by what's happened?
This is the Wall of Silence podcast, the ACNA 2 story. An account of church abuse and cover-up in the Anglican Church in North America, of things done and left undone, and why we should care about it. This is episode 16, Washington Post Aftermath Part 2, with Sam Lacy. Our disclaimer. If you have a conflict of interest regarding Bishop Ruch's presentment trial, it is my recommendation that you not listen to this episode until after the trial verdict has been announced. This specifically applies to those on the provincial tribunal, the court for the trial of a bishop, or if you are working with the trial in any related capacity. This episode continues my conversation with Sam Lacy, a lawyer and one of the lay presentment authors against Bishop Stewart Ruch, as we continue to process and react to the aftermath created from a series of Washington Post articles about Ruch's trial and with developing allegations toward ACNA Archbishop Steve Wood. Rather than discuss the details released in the articles as we did in the previous episode, Sam instead offers a lawyer's critique on what the presentment trial reveals about American church culture, as well as the reflection of a common churchgoer about how to address and talk about a church abuse scandal happening in our midst. The Wall of Silence often features long introductions as a way of offering context to our increasingly complicated story, as well as to get us caught up on the latest ACNA news. By comparison, this intro will be brief, but it is worth noting that since our last episode was released, Archbishop Wood has now been formally inhibited from practicing in ministry until a verdict is reached in his yet-to-be-determined presentment trial. Based on the ACNA's canons, Wood's inhibition comes through the decision of the dean of the province and 4 of the 5 senior diocesan bishops in the province, who are Alberto Morales, Eric Menes, Kenneth Ross, Clark Lowenfield, and Foley Beach. Perhaps complicating this decision is that, along with Wood's inhibition, Bishop Ray Sutton of the Reformed Episcopal Church has stepped down as dean of the province. In his place, he appointed Julian Dobbs, bishop of the Diocese of the Living Word. Woods' inhibition comes after mounting public pressure and a clergy letter calling for his formal inhibition, rather than a voluntary inhibition, as he previously called it, which is also a paid leave of absence. All of this begs for the competency and trustworthiness of the ACNA's upper leadership to receive more scrutiny, as the potential reasons behind the inhibition and Sutton's stepping down are highly suspect. As mentioned in one of the Washington Post articles, the ACNA's former communications director, Andrew Gross, reported that Bishops Sutton and Wood had discussed a, quote, bishop-friendly board of inquiry in a potential presentment against Wood. Sutton denied stating this to the Washington Post, but later, in his resignation letter, clarified that he, quote, could not recall such a conversation ever taking place, end quote. I encourage you to read the letter in full, pondering the ambiguity of Sutton's words. It's not exactly clear what he is or is not admitting to, and in my estimation, it looks like he's trying to squirm out of accountability by rendering the facts unintelligible. But there's more. Sutton also claims he is stepping down as dean of the province due to ongoing back issues, a very understandable explanation, especially for someone of his age, were it not for the fact that he remains the presiding bishop of the Reformed Episcopal Church, a position carrying with it by default a tremendous amount of time and responsibility. If it were me, my back would want to rest from that role as well. There's more to this story, which has been reported on by Ian Shapira in the Washington Post, Arlie Coles in the Living Church, and released in the official ACNA explanation of Wood's inhibition and Sutton's resignation. But it's worth noting for those following the details that at this moment, Bishop Julian Dobbs is the functional, de facto Archbishop of the ACNA, elected not by consensus, but instead appointed by Sutton himself. Finally, all of this comes after the actions and words of abuse survivors have continued to be maligned by ACNA leaders. The disparaging of the survivors and their advocates seems to be endemic to the ACNA, going back years. Andrew Gross, who is now speaking up and could be called a whistleblower regarding the actions of upper leadership, himself at one time discounted the cries of survivors, though I have not seen him publicly acknowledge or take responsibility for that yet. Other leaders, such as Bishop Felix Orji, echoed a repeated sentiment that the accusations towards Archbishop Wood and Bishop Ruch are a smear campaign, with other bishops, such as Chris Warner, calling the complainant's decision to speak with the Post's Ian Shapira, quote, disheartening because, as the article insinuates, there is the expectation by some that the College of Bishops will not seek to do the right things in this matter. Further, in the province's own communication to bishops and clergy about how to respond to the Post articles, they claim, quote, the complainants shared this document with an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, Ian Shapira, prior to its being circulated to the ACNA or any bishops, end quote. Which is to say, ACNA leadership is here complaining that the whistleblowers and alleged abuse survivors didn't go through the proper channels, didn't follow the process in addressing their allegations. Well, you can read through the complainant's 8-page letter to assess their account of how they did follow the procedure, how various ACNA bishops responded, and why they eventually did choose to go to the Washington Post. All of this is to ask, regular churchgoer in the ACNA, how much do you trust and support your own bishop at this point? Are they simply holding to the official PR statement of the province, or are they actually working to bring active reform? How are they speaking about abuse survivors and advocates? And, although this might be difficult to discern with limited information, how honest do you think they're being with you about what is happening in the ACNA and their own role in it all? Could it be possible they are actively wishing you would look the other way, and if enough time passes, you may forget about all these micro-indiscretions committed by themselves and others? This episode is a call to you, the listeners of this podcast, and potentially the lay people of the ACNA, and maybe other church denominations as well, to not forget, to not simply let the leaders take care of it, while they perpetually ask you to trust the process, while still blaming abuse survivors for speaking up. That is, until public pressure becomes too much and they finally have to address allegations, only to say something to the effect that what is happening is indicative of the fact that the ACNA takes the holiness and discipline of the church seriously, as it should. Do you trust the process? How is that process going so far? So, I leave my conversation with Sam Lacy in the hands of you, the people, the body of Christ, to do with what you will. I hope it sparks something in you and leads to prayer and conversation, and even confrontation, as necessary and as the Spirit leads you. Sam, I was giving you an update. Bishop Ruch's trial had ended this week. We're in the middle of October, and the bishop who was presiding over the trial, he released an official document from the court saying that they're going to deliberate for the full 60 days in order to come to the verdict, which is, it is what it is. But the way that this document was worded was those that are on the court, it was really a strong wording to the members of the court themselves. This has to remain confidential. You are not to speak to others outside of this. This will jeopardize the trial itself. And as a layperson, I'm not a layperson. I'm a minister. I'm a priest, but a layperson in terms of the law, right? In terms of canon law and how any of this works, I go, yeah, okay, confidentiality sounds good. But then the other part of me says, but this is the trial. Like these things should be made known. I mean, that's how this works. And many are wondering, are we ever going to receive any information about what was going on, what was presented? Or are we just going to get like a bland blanket statement of a verdict? Like this is what happened and this is what we decided about Bishop Ruch. So what are your thoughts on that? And I'd love, you go into a little bit of the history surrounding these types of trials.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a historian on this specific thing in terms of legal history, nor do I know like the history of canon law, but I do know like as the framers were coming up with our system and how, the judicial system would play out, and part of it also in drafting the Constitution was they had in mind this thing called the Star Chamber, which was basically a secret trial that occurred in England. And they had this visceral response, obviously, against it that says, if something is true and good and reasonable and procedures are airtight, there's no reason to make these things confidential. Sunshine's a good thing. The fact that people can perceive the proceedings as they occur, can debate those in the public square, that's a good thing. So I think any lawyer looking at the system that we, have now with the Ruch trial is completely baffled by what is this? What's happening? Why would they do this? I think even the stated reasons they had were to protect and preserve the integrity of the proceedings, which is the exact reason why you don't cloak proceedings. It's the very reason you make proceedings open to the public, is so that they can look and see in live action and say, okay, I see what's happening. I can make my own determinations as to whether I think this is just or unjust, rather than to hear post hoc from the very people who are presiding over the proceeding to say, hey, just trust us. This was fair. I mean, it breaks the brain of American lawyers. No one would enter in a proceeding and participate in a proceeding like that, because they would say from the outset, this is unjust, this is unfair, because the public has a right to see the proceedings. In this scenario, I can't think of anything that would be confidential aside from the victims' names and the parts of the victims' stories that they did not want exposed to the public. So they would have the right to that. I don't see, in fact, if anything, in a criminal setting specifically, Bishop Ruch, who is in this case the defendant in the ecclesiastical trial, he's the one who would invoke this right to an open and honest trial before the public, because it's in his best interest that everyone see, hey, see what's happening to me. You make up your own mind as to whether these proceedings are fair. The idea that he would even agree to a proceeding that would be veiled it doesn't make any sense. I don't understand why it would happen. Those who are lawyers on the court for the trial of the bishop, I don't understand how they can practice law in America and still actually agree that this would be good and this would be good for the church.
Now, again, you're not an expert on canon law, which I am not either. But do you see something almost as a kind of holdover from these types of trials that were in England at the time of the Revolution and the ages before?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is just concentration of power. And when you have the power and you have the ability to stifle dissent from the outset, you have the ability to even silence dissent from the outset. That way, you give people nothing to talk about. There is no conversation piece in terms of the details of the actual proceedings. So people do have, the dates, and I think now, although it's taken a long time for them to eventually come out with it, they do now have, there was a trial that was held, and it is, Bishop Ruch's trial. That's what they have. And so people will have their own opinions about that. But in terms of being able to see it in real time, that would be open to the public. The only reason I could see why they would do it is because they are very unsure of themselves, both as litigators, I guess in their role now as judges. And I can kind of sympathize with that because I'm not a judge, and when you're put on the spot, you are put into the seat of having to make, weighty decisions. That's hard. And you don't want to invite criticism. You don't want to be vulnerable to that. I understand that instinct. But what should override that instinct is this greater sense of duty to open proceedings, to the public good, that people see this as impartial, as fair, as timely. That should override any instinct of, oh my gosh, people are going to criticize me. And apparently that just hasn't happened here.
Wouldn't it get confusing? From what I gather, it was fully on Zoom, so I don't know that anybody was present with anybody else in a room. Wouldn't it get tricky if they had a victim that was giving testimony with a transcript? That's easy because you could redact that. But how would you release audio from that or video from it without, I don't know, having to blank them out or something like that? I don't know how anybody deals with that, the legalities of those types of steps.
Okay, so if I understand your correction right, you're understanding like the mechanics of if you were going to keep a part of it secret for the sake of the victim, meaning their testimony or their identity, how would you do that in real time? There are parts of trials that you can hold sealed. And I can imagine this would be a scenario where, there are child victims, things like that, testimony, sensitive testimony. You can certainly redact that. That doesn't have to be part of the public record. And the reason is because the details of that specifically, it's a balance of harm. So there's greater harm to the victim than that outweighs the public's right to an open and fair, not fair, but an open trial. So that's kind of, I think, the way a judge would kind of think about that. As to how they would have done that, my sense is like if one of the victims would have testified, which I'm not sure. I think there was one. And what they could have just said is that this testimony is not going to be live and they can either redact it later or they can just not put it up. And so I think that's what they probably should have done. But I don't think there was a huge risk of that because to my knowledge, and again, we don't know because we don't know the details of the proceeding. We don't know who testified and who didn't. So we don't know if there's a story here or not. I mean, this kind of just goes into churches generally, like this secretive nature of churches as a default, this idea that, hey, we're all very important up here and we wear our costumes and you guys don't. There should be this instinctive trust that you give to us that what we're doing is right. I just think it's so outmoded. I can't imagine like being a part of, I guess I am part of a church that is that way. But it's just, I can't imagine being a leader and thinking, yeah, hey, I think this is a good idea. Well, I would say, no, let's just allow people in on this conversation. More words are better. That doesn't mean it like renders infallible everything that someone says in that conversation. And it doesn't mean that you don't ultimately have the authority to make a decision on behalf of the congregation, or in this case, like the trial. Of course you do, because you've been given a leadership position. It's literally your job to do that. But it just means in doing so, you invite the community into the conversation to do two things. One, to help inform yourself, because you have blind spots like anyone else. And it just helps to see when you get more voices involved. And then two, it allays any fears that they have that somehow you're doing this black box style. You're doing it in a conference room behind closed doors and that you're privy to information that you're not giving them access to. And so everyone's just involved. And then I think trust is engendered much more easily in that setting than this idea of like, hey, trust us, we got this, don't look over there.
Which has been part of the rhetoric, which is the whole trust us rhetoric, while keeping things very secretive, under wraps, and that anything that would leak is really a dishonor to the court. I don't know how normal ACNA, parish members are perceiving it, but I think there's been enough of a consensus that many people are just left wondering what kind of trial this is.
Yeah, I think it's just a kangaroo trial. And I think the fact that it's had so many prosecutors and that they've stepped down for various reasons, they've criticized the proceedings themselves, they've, in small measure gone a little bit public. The idea, like even that the bishop or the trial court of the bishops had a public statement released, that is so foreign to a lawyer. Like the fact that you even have to say that probably says, yeah, I don't think it is. You can still have people who are very, very good at their job, they're very, very good attorneys, who are bad at this and who just don't have the instincts. I think that's probably true of all of us. I hope that I'm a pretty good attorney at this point, but it doesn't mean I see everything and that I don't have an instinct for everything. That's why you invite more voices in. I can't believe with the number of attorneys that have been involved with this, someone hasn't raised their hand and said, hey, just step one, what the heck are we doing? Why is this a closed proceeding? No one practices law in America in a closed proceeding. Why are we doing that? Why do we feel like we're so smart? And this is such a sensitive thing that we're somehow special, we're somehow different? And the answer is we're not different.
Regarding his comments up to this point in the episode, Sam, in a later memo he sent me, clarified and added to his points here, stating,
to be thorough, there are a limited number of proceedings that would not be open to the public, such as a grand jury proceeding, and that's where a prosecutor is seeking an indictment against a defendant. Juvenile proceedings, adoption proceedings, certain cases involving national security. These are not your run-of-the-mill criminal proceedings like we have with Bishop Ruch's trial. Those are very specific, and they have their own, often are accompanied with different rules of evidence, different federal procedures altogether. But the right to open judicial proceedings is found in the First and Sixth Amendment, the sixth being the accused's right to a speedy and public trial. And the First Amendment is where courts have found a general right to the public to have access to most proceedings. So the point I'm making there is that Bishop Ruch's trial, which is a very typical criminal proceeding, that would never be closed to the public. And that's why I think it's very strange here. That's something that they've decided on from the outset.
From what I hear, there are supposed to be new canon revisions that make future trials more open. And some people have questioned, well, why can't this one be open? I'm always fascinated with that divide between, well, here's the law or here's the rule. And so this would be the rule for this denomination, for this church denomination, versus, guys, this is insane. Like, yeah, it's the rule, but this is not benefiting anyone. I don't even know what to say to that. I think some people even doubt that even the new revisions to the canons are going to protect victims or protect people that are making claims towards those in church leadership.
Yeah, and it's the rules that we made. They're our rules. We can at any point decide these rules are silly. But it does take collective action by the people who actually have the power to do that and a collective will to do it. And I just don't think that's there. This is why institutions probably have a shelf life that it's good, and more institutions should die earlier.
I think attention is a finite resource, and I think all of us only have so much of it. And I think our leaders know this, and they go to great pains to kind of maximize their program time and especially sermon time. And they use that to highlight the things that they care about, the things that truly matter to the church. And I think the point I want to make is, in light of, especially the Post article and how detailed it is with Bishop Ruch and now Archbishop Wood, if your church is not directing your gaze to those issues of abuse when it's lurking, like not just next door, but like in your own backyard, as a parishioner, you should ask why. And I think I've been very consistent in my messaging that I'm not advocating for sowing fear in the minds of congregants that there is an abuser in every church or in every program. But when there are credible accusations of abuse and the response is silence at the local level, you should be very suspicious. And I think that suspicion should prompt curiosity that then activates you to ask questions. I think, like, I look back on my own time in the last 2 years at our own church and me putting my head together with Megan and others. And I think I should have been more vocal. I think I should have been more willing to earn a reputation for being an alarmist. And I think, you know why? Because we're right. We're absolutely right. And ACNA 2 has chronicled how right this is in terms of all the multitude of cases within the ACNA that show abusers populate every level of this denomination, almost like to an epidemic level.
In another clarifying memo, Sam added this about the prevalence of abuse in the ACNA.
So just consider this. ACNA 2 has heard from 240 individuals alleging some form of abuse. Sometimes that could mean up to 20 people with allegations of abuse around the same person, but there are 83 different clergy that have allegations of abuse against them. And of those, 48 involve sexual abuse, grooming, sexual harassment, or the mishandling of reports of child sex abuse.
And I think it's the leaders at the lowest level, and this is kind of counterintuitive because it goes against the very way in which the ACNA is structured. It's the leaders at the lowest level, so priests and deacons, think about that, who have, I think, the best chance to stop it and to begin the process of accountability because they are the most proximate, typically, to the abuse. And so what often happens is there's this idea of the diffusion of responsibility, which is, no one acts because everyone in the room is waiting for someone else to act first. And that often is why people are just paralyzed. And that's the cancer in our churches. And I think that happens mostly it happens everywhere, but especially at the local level. And I just think it's really ironic that in a denomination that really boasts or promotes its hierarchy as a structural mechanism to safeguard its people from abuse, it's that very mechanism, it's that very hierarchy that is blaming the opportunities for abuse. So I think if you're wondering if your pastor and your deacons and your elders, if they care about this, when I say this, I mean the recent Post article of Archbishop Wood and Bishop Ruch. If you wonder if your local church cares about this, you look at the way that they're messaging about it right now. because we know they curate every minute of their services. So if they think this deserves or is worthy of community grief, community prayer discussion, you'll know. They will tell you. And if they don't, if they relegate this to an email, like my church does, this is all email fodder. Put it out in an email. Here's a hyperlink. Go there. Maybe come to me, although to my knowledge, I don't even think our local priest has said he can come to me. He might have. But certainly there's no communal conversation. If that's the response, you'll also have your answer.
Tell me, does this relate? In my own experience with my former bishop, the messaging to me was, and this was in his letter to me, and he even made it clearer when I met with him, was, I appreciate your heart for this, but I'm calling you to intercede, to pray for this. And that was his way of saying, stop doing what you're doing. Now, again, calls to prayer are always good in a general sense. But it's interesting how the messaging was, this is not your fight, this is not your battle. And one of the things that I've seen, because in the ACNA, and I can't speak in the broader Anglican context, but everything becomes so localized that we're then taught like that's their problem out there. What I think is interesting about what's happened with Archbishop Wood, and we have to let more things come to light, and the quote process take over. But now we can't get away from, it's actually not out there. It's the Archbishop now, right? So it is interesting how almost like a chessboard, right? This move has forced, you can't just deny it now. You can't just relegate it to an email. It has to be addressed, hopefully, everywhere.
Yeah, so a few things in response to that. One, I think this post article has put a target on every back of every priest and deacon in the ACNA. And what I mean by that is that it's put the focus on them to say, how now will you respond? What will be your response? The light is on you. We are all watching you. Let's see how you do this.
When does a church that's situated like ours ever talk about this stuff? Like, at what point do things keep stacking up that you're willing to say, man, enough? I know we've been adjacent to this, or we've been 2 steps removed because the abuse didn't happen in our place, and nor do we know facts about abuse that occurred, and it's incumbent upon us to speak to a higher up. Really, their position was like, we're just trying to hold someone accountable who didn't hold a person accountable. So I think it's so hard to talk about this because I feel like you're put in a position of having to fill in the gaps and having to speculate because there's just such a dearth of information about any of this. There's no conversation, there's no acknowledgement, there's no anything. And so I don't think it's irrational for the few of us who do know about these things to fill in the blanks naturally, to try to figure out, well, what could they possibly be thinking by not talking about this? Is there no urgency? Is this not important to them? Is it just they're so busy? Are there fires they're putting out everywhere? Like what could possibly be overwhelming them such that they would say, you know what, this is just not on our list? And then, in light of the presentment now against the Archbishop and the Washington Post article, like at what point are you a priest over a parish and you say, I mean, in some way we're all contaminated here. And maybe contaminated is not the right word. But in some way, we're all implicated by what's happened because structurally, we're implicated. Structurally, we're involved in this, whether we want to or not. And then you acknowledge it and you say something, and you don't say everything, and maybe you don't even know what to say. And I think that's fine that you don't know what to say. But frankly, none of us know what to say. But I'm not an expert on any of this. But I do have, I guess the instinct is like, what the heck? We should talk about this. And why would someone else not talk about it? I think that's what's really just gnaws at me, is this, not only that you don't talk about it, but there is no explanation whatsoever about why you're not talking about it. It's like you're allowed to just wash your hands completely and throw your head in the sand and hands over your ears, say, this is not happening.
And Connor Hansen, one of the presentment authors, we were texting yesterday about this, and he said this incredible quote. This is from Fleming Rutledge. She's an Episcopal priest. She said pastors should preach with the Bible in the one hand and the New York Times in the other. And the idea behind that is that you shouldn't be so detached and away from the world and what's happening that you can't then interpret your Bible. And neither should you be so like ensconced in the world that then you're unmoored from Scripture. It's this idea that we are people in the world trying to be salt and light. And if we can't stay attuned to what's happening, and so of course I thought, man, we have the Post right now shining a light in our denomination, and we have, the Lord, we have His Spirit, we have His Scriptures. Let's talk about both. Let's bring this both to bear on what's right in front of us, and we'll see. We'll see what our local parish does. I've already told you what I think, what has been their response, what I think will be their response, but I hope it's different.
In terms of like a denomination, a national organization, maybe one of the things that I could point to is people love to share in the victories. And so like if something great is happening in the ACNA as a church denomination, then we say something along, oh, look at what God is doing, look at this initiative, this mission venture. But then if it is something awful, which is what we are enduring right now we silo off and we're like, well, that's not happening there. We're going to take care of our congregation, our church community, and also we're going to let them take care of this. And we have the hands off. This is not my jurisdiction. And some of that could be wise in terms of letting a process take place, although we've seen over the years that the process itself is very, very flawed. But it is interesting, as you say, the avoidance of talking about things that make us uncomfortable. What is it? Is it because in America, everything is a PR scheme. Everything is we have to approach it as if, well, this is bad press. And so therefore, if saying anything would be bad press, let's not say anything at all. Right? Is that kind of what's happening, in the sense of if we muddy the waters at all, it'll immediately look bad on us? I wonder if that's what's happening. And I guess I'm with you in the sense that there are so many difficult conversations to have. And in our day and age, maybe we just need to learn how to have them and continually have them, especially when people are hurting, right? Like that's kind of what I go to. The more we don't talk about these things, all of these people who have been desperately wounded and have already been silenced and who already haven't had their stories listened to by church leaders, instead they're actually rejected. I was engaging in an online conversation today. I'll quote this person on Facebook. They say, we have an overblown victimization culture that casts stones before any due process is heard. We're now into a 5 or 10 year reaction against the Me Too movement, which is, hey, if you're raising your voice up, you're a victim with an axe to grind. You're probably just lying anyway. And we like to think that denying the stories of victims hasn't infected the church, but it's kind of all I see when it comes to how the church responds to victims.
Well, I think what you're talking about is this posture of the PR, of looking out there and feeling like the optics have to fit in order for us to address something, or this acknowledgement that, or this some implicit recognition that the optics are always out there. And so we need to bend the frame in such a way that, and I don't even think like our pastors necessarily doing this, or even pastors in general. I just think this is ingrained in us because the culture is it's the air we breathe. That we have our antennae up to say, how's this going to look? How's this going to look? How's this going to play out? And my appeal would be to say, kind of like what you were suggesting before, is people want to celebrate the victories and they say, look what God's doing. I want to say, in this, what's happening right now in the ACNA, look what God's doing. Judgment is a really, really good thing. And we need to learn to get on board with that. We need to learn to celebrate judgment. That sounds so weird. I get that. I invite that in my own life. Where I feel like, man, I suck at this. I want people to tell me, and maybe I need the timing and the tone and the tact by a specific person. I get that. But however or whenever it's delivered, at some point, I want that. I absolutely need that. Otherwise, there is no growth happening. I'm stagnating or I'm going down. And so I think as an institution or as a small parish, I think we need to kind of talk more about this idea of like when things go awry in our situation by our own leaders, this isn't bad and we shouldn't run, we shouldn't recede. We should lean into this and we should say, this is from the Lord. This is not a victimization culture with, the lack of due process.
Can you parse that out a little bit in terms of, I get it because I've taught the Constitution, and I try to wrap my head around what due process looks like and why that's important for us as citizens. How do you separate that out in terms of a church discipline or a church trial?
I just think like we are so thoroughly American in our church institutions, that we cannot neatly separate what we feel like we are entitled to, our rights. And as a citizen of an American church, I want this, this, and this. And I just think that is really good Americanism and really bad Christianity. And I think more so the idea of even just these individual rights is just, we have to die to. We have to come to grips with the fact that in Christ, what we're losing is rights. And what we're losing is this right to feel vindicated all the time. And rather, we should be having these eyes of, could I suffer? Could my individual rights or whatever suffer for the sake of this community? Because that seems to be the calling that we should all be living into. And so if the knee-jerk reaction to some of these things is like, well, what about, why aren't they going to be defended? What about this? And don't they have a right to? I'm like, yeah, that is all very legal. And I understand that in a specific context. But in the church, we have to adopt a radically different lens for how we approach these things. And I still think that lens can get towards the truth and foster love and foster a safe harbor for victims in a much better way, frankly, than what I think our American Constitution has created. It's just we don't have an imagination. And because we don't have imagination for it, we're grasping. We are desperate for some outside entity or some other treatise, frankly, the U.S. Constitution Declaration, to give us inspiration on how do we do this. Because God ain't enough, our Bible ain't enough, our creeds aren't enough, and certainly our community and the love that we are supposed to inhabit between each other isn't enough. And so we're looking for an outside authority to tell us how to do that. Of course, there's room for experts in all these things, and those experts are so good in their specific areas of, especially experts on abuse, about speaking to victims, about even legal experts, about canon law. Of course, we need those.
But this idea of we've almost reflexively just adopted what America's given us to help us work through our own issues in the church, and maybe that's not the best thing. What I'm not saying there, and I think, the church just, we're too American and we're not thoroughly Christian. And that's true. That's absolutely true. But what I'm not saying is that there shouldn't be a process, and that we shouldn't be able to kind of borrow from other, institutions or whatever in order to help us refine that process. I think that's part of it. And we should, and Christians should be thoughtful about it. I think what I'm against is this wholesale, unreflective adoption of this thing that we're familiar with, and then that we use almost against ourselves in the church to say, well, he didn't get all his due process rights. And what I just want to do is hit the brakes on that a little bit and say, due process is real and it's good and it's meant for a specific context. And maybe that context is here, but I don't know that should be our default. And I don't know that should come out first and to say we need to have this checklist or punch list of things that I just think we're too quickly trotting out the American system to try to serve issues that are deeply theological. And I don't know that that's producing the outcomes that we want. Sometimes it actually has perverse outcomes, especially when, in this situation, think about the trial. We're doing this half measure. We're using the American system, but we're cloaking it. And that's not the American system at all. In fact, it's a betrayal of the system. I think it's an identity crisis. And I think it should go back to almost first principles of who are we as a church? What are the things that we value? What have we been asked to do? What's the mandate on us? And then we should be able to kind of take culture as a grab bag and say, well, let's pick from these things to put together a process that reflects our values.
Something that you said earlier about judgment really resonated with me. I was listening to an interview with Stephen Colbert, comedian, talk show host, and Anderson Cooper. And Anderson Cooper, he has this podcast all about grief. And so he brought Stephen Colbert on there because he's had some incredible loss in his life where he lost his father and two of his brothers in a plane crash. And there's this little quote that stuck with me. I like it because you have to kind of just sit with the quote, and you can't fully explain it away. You just kind of have to just let it be. And it's this: what punishments of God are not gifts? Part of his story was the worst thing in the world happened to him. He lost his dad. He lost brothers, siblings. But in the midst of it, he has found God's grace throughout the years. And I guess there's a lot to unpack there. We can get into some theodicy and how do we deal with God working in the world and evil and our sin and all that. Maybe what I hear you reflecting on is, okay, this has now come to light on a national stage. People are talking about this beyond just the church blogosphere. Things have come to light. And of course, we can talk about, maybe things are still alleged. What are the actual facts? But those will continue to be discussed. Do I hear you kind of saying that if this is judgment, if this is the consequence for all of this happening, shouldn't we be thanking God for this and accepting it for what it is? Am I hearing you say that?
I mean, absolutely. I'll just state that explicitly. I mean, that's exactly what we should be. I think cleaning the house in the ACNA is God's judgment. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a process that the Archbishop and anyone else is to go through. You can talk to ACNA 2 people better who would better know this, but just off like the top of my head, it just seems, and maybe it's because I have a specific radar for the ACNA 2 or ACNA rather right now, is don't these things just keep happening? Isn't there like this wild concentration of accusations against our leaders, even at the highest levels, bishops, archbishop now, individual priests? Isn't this kind of gross? At what point is it gross enough for churches where they're ACNA churches, that is, where there may not be any of this happening, for them to just raise their hand and say, like, oh my gosh, shouldn't we question like even the thing that we're in? And are there structural something happen here that allows this to kind of flourish? But yeah, I think what's happening right now is good. I don't think this is a wringing of hands. We should all be mourning.
Or blaming it as this is some woke liberal agenda that's attacking the church. Again, pointing the fingers to the outside, or even to those that used to be faithful ACNA members, but now they've become woke. And again, I actually hate the use of that term because it's just so lazy, and it hardly encapsulates anything of any meaning anymore. But I can see it happening, right? Rather than accepting it for what it is, right? Instead, they're going to start blaming others.
No, I totally agree. I just think we are far afield from where we thought we should be. And I hope our leaders, and when I say leaders right now, I'm just saying like we need to rely on the leaders at the lowest levels to start recognizing this. And because clearly, I don't know if there's a bishop, and certainly not an archbishop, that you can trust them as far as you can throw them. And that's not for me to pick on anyone specifically, but it's just like automatically right now, if you hold those positions, I don't trust you.
Are you familiar with the image, the kind of the myth of the Ouroboros?
No.
You know what that is? It's the image of a snake in a circle, and it's eating its own tail.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's the snake eating itself. I don't think this is not a Christian symbol. And in fact, it's the opposite. The Christian symbol is the cross, the laying down of one's life.
Yeah.
The Ouroboros is we're gonna devour each other. We think we're gonna have some kind of victory, but we're actually just eating ourselves. We're eating our own tail. What I'm curious of and happening, and someone in ACNA 2 has lifted this up already, is are the other bishops vying for power? We don't know what's going to happen with Archbishop Wood. We don't know any decisions there or what he's going to do, or maybe by the time this comes out, something will have been announced. I don't know. We have no idea. But the question would be are those bishops that you just mentioned that we don't really know if we can trust any of them, are they going to sit around in sackcloth and ashes like they should be? Or are they going to be vying for power to be the next one in charge? And I just wonder, I think that's an interesting challenge for all leaders in the church. Is this about a power grab, or are we here to wash each other's feet and serve each other in the name of Christ?
Yeah,
right.
I think it's an open question. I think now is there's so much contamination at all the levels that for someone like me, just kind of I sit in a pew and I don't take on leadership positions, even our local church, stuff like that. I'm just there to, be with my family, get to the table, things like that. Would there be a bishop that would rise up and maybe rise up to be too political or too strong, but basically that would command the attention of others, that would be trusted enough to be able to take over the reins and go forward. I mean, these are problems that all institutions have, of course. And I know, like Pope Francis, for example, I think when it was his opportunity to become Pope, and I think he regained a lot of trust in a lot of the people at the grassroots level. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for that for any of the bishops there. I don't know. Like I said, implicitly, even if some were to, it's so shrouded in. My response is just the automatic distrust that I don't know that I would get there. It would take a long time.
I said to my wife, I think today or yesterday, is I think the people who have the best instincts about this are non-Christians. And what I mean by that is I said to Jamie, I would love to give this article, maybe we will, to there's a ton of friends who are not Christians, and just say, hey, what do you think about this? What's your first thought? What's your first instinct? And I think that often is the right one. It's hard to know why that is. And it's such an indictment, too, of kind of like my own faith to say, I think they probably have a better nose for this than we do. And I think mostly it's because they have no relationship to any of these people. They have no incentive. They don't have skin in the game. All they want is justice, and they're prompted by anger, naturally.
I haven't read all of the public responses from the various ACNA bishops who have sent something out to their dioceses. After the Washington Post articles came out, someone released or perhaps leaked a document, as mentioned at the beginning of this episode, with talking points for how local clergy and church leaders should respond to media inquiries or people asking about the allegations. Most of the responses from the bishops so far have mostly adhered to the suggested talking points, with various expected idiosyncrasies, with some calling for grief and repentance and others bemoaning how the various victims, especially Claire Buxton, who was accusing Archbishop Wood, went to a news outlet rather than to try and work things out with Wood himself first. I saw other bishops, most notably the former Archbishop Foley Beach, raise the concern that people are really going to start thinking that we don't have a functioning system in place to handle abuse scandals, that the ACNA as an organization is somehow corrupt. And again, as Bishop Chris Warner said, all of this is, quote, disheartening because, as the article insinuates, there is the expectation by some that the College of Bishops will not seek to do the right thing in this matter. Yes, ACNA leaders, if you're not careful, people really might start thinking that. I say that facetiously, of course, as so many of us have been raising a cry for years now, but it is worth pointing out that many regular churchgoers in the ACNA are only just now finding out about these all-encompassing problems, from the local to the diocesan to the provincial level, and it will be up to us to figure out how to bring them up to speed with a winsome mixture of grace and austerity. One bishop, however, Chip Edgar, went off script from the talking points, saying that he wished he had been more aware when the ACNA was being formed in 2009. But looking back, he sees now that there was, quote, a troublesome spirit of pride at work as we constituted the ACNA. Here was our sin. We were so focused on the evil outside of ourselves that we couldn't see the sin within us. End quote. Sam and I recorded our conversation before I read Bishop Edgar's letter, which is worth reading. But it's significant to note that Sam's words about the goodness of receiving God's judgment parallel Edgar's, when he says later on, quote, in these storms, is God winnowing, sifting, purging? It is hard for me not to think so, but I also remember that he chastens those he loves. He wants better from us. Ultimately, he wants better for us. Those truths aren't just for the ACNA. They're for all his people. End quote. I think the arduous, perhaps conflicting call for those of us deeply enmeshed in church culture is to look both within and without ourselves in a moment like this. How is God calling us as individuals within our church communities and at a national level about sober repentance and actual lasting changes to our safeguarding policies and the spirit we choose to implement them with? How might we cultivate a church culture where our leaders are no longer allowed to wield their unassailable swords of authority over us because they're bishops and we owe them our respect, reverence, allegiance, and apparently, in so many instances, our full obedience. All while abuse victims and survivors are left vulnerable and ultimately disbelieved anyway. But how do we also, as Sam has challenged us, pluck up enough courage to look outside the church for wise friends and counselors who can offer us some perspective about how all of this looks to them? Maybe we've circled the wagons so long that everything on the outside looks like a threat, when it's possible someone's out there who can help us. This might sound scandalous to admit, but I have gained great insights and learned life-changing lessons from those who do not claim Christ as Lord. To be honest, it's not so hard. We do live in a vast, big world after all. In the context of this podcast, I've learned so much from Joanna Rudenborg, both in her own words to me, her words offering direct challenge to Stewart Ruch and the leadership of his diocese, and in her recorded accounts on this podcast. Rather than demonizing her and finding her a threat, it's her insights as an outsider, but also as someone who has taken the time to grow on her own and become something of an expert in her chosen subject matter that has enabled her a voice to be reckoned with. I imagine, for those of us still in ACNA churches, there are voices now arising or that would be willing to offer themselves that would help us greatly in this moment of crisis. But we first have to be willing to listen. My conversation with Sam continues in the next episode, where we explore with more depth what it means to speak up about church abuse within a church culture that only wants to look the other way. If you believe in what the Wall of Silence podcast is trying to accomplish, please consider supporting us through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Wall of Silence podcast. This month, I will feature an extra part of our interview with Sam Lacy, so please check that out. Thanks for the support. I appreciate it. The Wall of Silence podcast is produced and edited by me, Chris Marchand. I also record the music, and our artwork is by Alice Mitchlick. You can find her other work or commission a piece through her Instagram account, Mouthful of Stars. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or whatever service you listen on. You can find a link to the transcript of this episode, including related article links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening.